Clones built and cloning across the surface. I've created a physical sky. I want to create a reflective material that I can put on my clones. So I'm going to make a new material. Down in my materials library, I'm going to create a new material. And I'm going to double click this. And what we're looking at in terms of reflections and shininess is this reflectance function that we've got, or reflectance attribute. The first thing that we've got in the default in reflectance is something called Specular. Now this reflectance channel is kind of like a Photoshop file. It has layers of attributes. At the top section we can see what layers we've got. The only layer we've got is this thing called default specular. A specular attribute is a highlight. It's a little shiny highlight that you get on any surface that is shiny. Different types of surfaces have different types of specular functions. If you think of something like, I guess something like satin or brushed metal, it's quite a soft kind of smooth reflection. If you think of something like a really highly polished pool ball or billiards ball, they often have really bright little highlights on them. So this specular component, this specular attribute is the shininess of a shiny surface. The way that we control it in this material editor is with the specular strength. We can drag that slider left and right, and what you can see in the graphs here is we've got a preview of what our specular highlight looks like. We also have this little graph. This is sort of a visual representation of the brightness of that highlight. So as we increase the specular strength, this little graph of values gets higher, and we can see the center of this highlight gets brighter. The other thing that's important is the width of this highlight. As we drag the width to the left, we can see we get a very sharp, bright specular highlight. It's very small, like something very shiny. As we drag it to the right, we get a broader, softer highlight. So by changing these two parameters, this width and the specular strength, we can get different types of shininess depending on what sort of surface we're looking for. Now I want quite a sort of a glassy, intense, reflective surface. So I'm going to have a small, bright highlight for a start. So my width is somewhere around 20%. My specular strength is quite high, up around 90%. And I can see on this little preview that I've got here of this sphere, I've got a bright little highlight on my surface. And I can see as well on my overall material preview here, I can see now I've got a bright little highlight. So this controls just the bright, shiny parts. What we want to do now is add a reflective layer. So in reflectance, we've got a specular layer. We can add using this top button up near the layers. I'm going to add, and I'm going to use a function called GGX. I don't know what that stands for. It's a type of reflection. All these odd names in here are named after mathematicians who developed the algorithms that control how computers draw surface shading. It's not particularly intuitive, but what I know from using Cinema4D is that this GGX is good for making metallic type reflections. So I'm going to click on that, and now I can see I've got two layers in my reflectance channel. I've got a reflection layer and I've got a specular layer. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to put my specular layer on the top of my reflection. So in these two layers near the top, I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm going to put my specular layer over the top of the reflection. I want my material to reflect with a highlight, a shiny highlight over the top of it. Now where it says layer 1, which is our new layer, I'm going to double click that and name it reflection. That way I know what my two layers are. So I've got my specular over the top and my reflection underneath. And next to those you'll see the different types of blending modes. If you've used Photoshop or After Effects, you'll know that when you put graphics one on top of another, you can blend them with different types of modes. The default is an additive mode for going over the specular over the top. I'm going to leave that as it is. Now in the reflection layer, as soon as we have that created, we've now got reflections in our material. We can test that by dragging and dropping this material onto our two cloners. Once we've done that, we may see in our view, we may see a slight preview of that. It depends on your computer really and your graphics card. But if we hit Shift R, which is to render this view, we can hopefully see we're going to start to get reflections now. Now what will happen is, because we've got reflections, is that our renders take a lot longer to calculate. The computer's having to calculate all the, I guess, the light bouncing off these surfaces and reflecting other things. So it does take a lot longer to render. This is also quite a complex object. It has a lot of geometry, so there's a lot of reflections there for the computer to calculate. So we've got a lot of reflections going on now. We're mostly reflecting the sky, so I'm seeing sort of whites and blues. And this is taking quite a while to render. It's starting to get through it a little quicker now. So the other thing that we can do, because this is taking quite a while to render, if we hit Command B to go into our render settings, we can go to that physical renderer, and remember this shading error threshold, this percentage value that we've got in our settings, this controls the speed and quality of our renders. I'd quite like to be able to render this a bit faster to test how my materials are working, so I'm going to set this value to quite high, somewhere around 60%. It's going to mean I get a lot of noise and grain and bad anti-aliasing in my image, but while I'm testing my material, it'll be much quicker and I'll be able to see what I'm doing and the results of my changes much faster. Okay, I'm going to go back to my material. So I've got a super shiny reflective surface now. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give my surface a little bit of colour. So I'm going to go back to my colour channel, and rather than just being this pale sort of off-white, light grey, I'm going to tint mine slightly reddish perhaps. You can tint it whatever you want, but you should see as you start to change the colour, you'll see your preview material swatch will start to change colour. You can also go back to your reflectance channel, and we have a global reflection brightness that we can turn down. So if we don't want quite as much reflection, we can turn down the global reflection brightness, and we start to get more of the tinted colour in there rather than just this mirror-like reflection. So if I hit Shift R again to render that, now I can see my render's going much faster because I changed my quality. There is a lot of grain, the anti-aliasing is not very good, but at least I can see my changes in my renders much more quickly now while I do tests. So I've got a really nice glossy, super reflective material going on now. And I might tweak that a little bit, and once I'm happy with it, I can turn my render settings back to a much better quality and do a final render.